Is the Kybalion really hermetic? What even is hermetic, or hermeticism for that matter? So this is a problem of definitions. And if we want to tackle this issue from the angle of an historian, what do we need to do when we come across a problem of definitions? Well, we need to accept that there are a few senses in which definitions can be taken, at least when it comes to understanding the quote-unquote real presence of something from an historical perspective. If we want to grasp an ism, and remember most ism formulations are relatively modern phenomena, there are three ways we can approach the question of whether or not they actually existed in the past. First, there is what we might call the substantive or essentialist approach to a term. Then there's the functionalist approach, and lastly, there's the nominalist approach. This threefold division I appropriated from Ariel Hassayon's studies on the terms radicalism and esotericism, and here I'll be applying that division to Hermeticism specifically as it relates to the Kybalion. In the substantive approach, one tackles the problem by positing that there was a single continuous and identifiable tradition, a system or set of mutually reinforcing ideas that was provably passed on from mouth to ear or text to eye, unbroken from generation to generation, stretching all the way back to, at the very least, the 2nd century AD, if not earlier. The substantive or essentialist approach also tends to be the so-called religionist approach. It tries to understand the subject ahistorically, often treating the ism as a thing that, like Athena, sprang fully formed from the head of Zeus, rather than as a complex aggregate of parts, each with their own histories. In this approach, we have to pinpoint a set of defining features of what constitutes this tradition, that is, not just circumscribing it, identifying the components that fall under its aegis, but giving its sine qua non, that is, identifying the components without which it would not exist. This is the approach that tries to get at the Platonic essence, if you will, of what, say, Hermeticism really is in its most irreducible form. In the functionalist approach, however, we look at how our ism may have existed in certain times and places, not necessarily as a substantive and unbroken tradition, but we have to highlight a number of functions this ism reliably performs. In this case, we'd have to ask, in general, what does a hermetic text do? What role does it serve? Lastly, in the nominalist approach, which is typically the favorite approach of academics, we say a particular ism did not exist until it was explicitly named. Alternatively, when it comes to something like Hermeticism, this is the position that would maintain that a work is hermetic, not if it immutably contains a substantive set of hermetic ideas, but more precisely if it unambiguously bears the name of Hermes, or is in some way attributed to Hermes. Quite some time ago, I ran a poll online for everyone to give me their own idiosyncratic definitions of Hermeticism, and here's a handful of what I got. Just notice how from this handful, different definitions attack the problem from different perspectives. So first, I got any tradition that makes use whatsoever of Hermes, with the sole exception of the Kybalion, which is worthless garbage. So here we've got a strictly nominalist approach, along with a firmly stated exception. Thank you for that, Ted. Another definition given was the sealing and unsealing of vessels in the literal and figurative sense. This one is something like a functionalist approach, presumably putting lots of stress on the concept of hermetically sealing and unsealing secrets, that is, speaking esoterically. Another definition given was ascending systematization. So presumably this is a substantive definition which stresses the hierarchical classification of the world as a defining feature of Hermeticism. There's certainly a lot about that in the Asclepius, for example, chapter 4. Another definition was the belief that that which is above is like unto that which is below. So, a substantive view, a view rooted in one particular teaching from one Hermetic text, in this case the Emerald Tablet, which in the Arabic pseudo-Aristotelian Secret of Secrets, or Sihr al-Asrar, is attributed directly to Hermes. Next, we have, quote, simply magic. A substantive or possibly functionalist view that is either very interested in the practical hermetica or may be tied up with the Yeats thesis in her famous or infamous work, Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic Tradition. After this, we have, quote, the synthesis of general and special revelation, which sounds to me like a functionalist approach. And lastly, someone wrote in, I can't tell you, but I can show you. A definition, if we can call it that, stressing the function of esotericism and of first-hand initiation. I should note here that when asked to define Hermeticism in an interview, Brian Copenhaver, the translator of our most recent and accurate English Corpus Hermeticum, just said that he would rather not because he thinks it's impossible. So that's something to consider in all of this definitional madness we're about to engage in. I should note that if you read up on the Wikipedia article for Hermeticism, it also gives a number of different definitions, if you can call them that, and these clearly show some signs of using the three perspectives with which we can approach this label, in a substantialist, a functionalist, and a nominalist way. So, using each of these three different approaches in honor of the thrice greatest, let's take a look at the three ways in which any given text can or cannot be considered hermetic, and apply these litmus tests to the Kybalion while comparing it to a handful of other texts that are generally considered, without too much controversy, hermetic. Note that in all this, I have no intention of going down the rabbit hole of authorship or attribution in much detail. If you're interested in this question, you can check out Nicholas Chappell's article, The Kybalion's New Clothes, an early 20th century text's dubious association with Hermeticism, for more details on that. Although the gist of it is, it was William Walker Atkinson, or at least in the 1912 edition of Who's Who in America, Atkinson's self-submitted biographical entry includes the Kybalion among his list of works. And that's to say nothing of all the similarities between the Kybalion and his other writings which focus on similar themes, such as the theme of 7 cosmic universal laws. So let's first address the substantive approach to the question of whether or not the Kybalion is truly hermetic. Probably the best way to do this, albeit not without its own issues, is to find out if the text coincides with the general philosophical ideas and cosmology laid out in the Greco-Egyptian Corpus Hermeticum. Here we do not care if a work is attributed to Hermes, and we do not care what function the text is serving. All we want to know is, what are the main ideas laid out in the Kybalion, and do they coincide with the ideas contained in the earliest known works of Hermetic literature, or any works for that matter? Perhaps somewhere to start with this question is to look at cosmology, since this aspect of Hermetic literature is what provides us with some picture of the all, namely the Weltanschauung, or the worldview of the people who produced it. So, above all, what is the general philosophical cosmology laid out in the Corpus Hermeticum? What we'll find right out the gate is that summarizing this succinctly is quite difficult. This is especially so given that there is no single cohesive corpus of Hermetic philosophy, but rather a handful of works gathered together under the label of Hermetic writings, which happen to have survived together, but were not necessarily written together in order to produce one cohesive whole. The texts in the Corpus Hermeticum were not themselves written to provide a unified intertextual mass. There are contradictions and differences between the texts, and we cannot simply iron over those differences in hopes to produce a crystal clear doctrine or ism that is unchanging from generation to generation. All we can do here, then, is look for some common denominators and enshrine them as the real tradition. Is this fair? Probably not, but this approach is fairly typical for people looking to define ill-defined and ill-definable phenomena. So here I will call upon a description drawn up by the scholar Garth Fowden, author of the Egyptian Hermes, to summarize the cosmos taught in the Hermetica. This is a description that seemed sufficient enough to Kevin van Bladel for him to include it in his work on the Arabic Hermes, and I personally think that it's as solid a definition as any. Now, here's an example of what I might call one substantive definition of Hermetic belief, at least insofar as it pertains to cosmology, and Fowden summarizes it as follows. The belief that, quote, God is one and the creator of all things, which continue to depend on God as elements in a hierarchy of beings. Second in this hierarchy after God himself comes the intelligible world of nous or mind, and then the sensible world of matter. The creative and beneficent powers of God flow through the intelligible and sensible realms to the sun, which is the demiurge around which revolve the 8 spheres of the fixed stars, the planets, and the earth. From these spheres depend the daimons, and from the daimons, man, who is a microcosm of creation. Thus, everything is part of God, and God is in everything. His creative activity continuing unceasingly. All things are one, and the pleroma of being is indestructible. So this is but one of many possible substantive definitions of Hermeticism. Is this the one all-encompassing definition of Hermeticism? By no means. It isn't even technically a definition, so much as a description. But it is one thorough attempt to pin down the cosmology that encompasses the worldview, informing the many texts that make up the Corpus Hermeticum. You may have your own idiosyncratic definitions, but I feel that this description really captures a lot of the common denominators among the many ancient Hermetic texts that we're looking for in assembling a substantive definition. Now, the problem with this substantive approach is that there's very little written here that did not already belong to earlier traditions that came before antique Hermeticism. As you all probably know already, this so-called Hermetic worldview did not emerge in a vacuum. It has clear textual predecessors, and we can see its roots in the cosmos of Plato's Timaeus, in the ascent literature of the Stoics, and in the allegorical and mystical writings of the Middle Platonists, and so forth. All of these movements were part and parcel with a broader movement that has been called by Wouter Hanegraaff, famously or infamously, Platonic Orientalism. Alternately, Hermeticism has been called one of the many currents within what John Dillon called the Platonic underground, alongside other sub-movements like Gnosticism, groups who adopted the language of the mystery religions, such as those practiced at Eleusis near Athens, or by the cult of Isis in Egypt. And while there were certainly people who wrote the texts across the centuries which ended up collected together in this modern compendium we call today the Corpus Hermeticum, there's always the issue that among these various texts, there's no clear, definitive, distinguishing doctrine or feature within them that might distinguish them from other late antique pagan theological texts, like, say, the Chaldean oracles, which are not Hermetic but espouse a very similar vision of the world, including most, if not all, of the points touched on in Fowden's definition. So this definition has its issues, chiefly because it doesn't serve to set Hermeticism apart from the traditions that fed into it to begin with, or the traditions that developed alongside of it in parallel. This is usually a problem with substantive definitions, that they seldom actually scratch to the essential heart or sine qua non of a thing. In any case, how does the Kybalion stand up to this particular Hermetic worldview? I think this one is complicated because there are many ways in which the Kybalion is not Hermetic according to it, but there are also plenty of ways in which it is too. Well, sort of. So let's discuss one of these ways. For example, Fowden's definition or description of Hermeticism speaks of 3 worlds: the world of God, the intelligible world, and the world of sense. The Kybalion shares this breakdown to some extent, but calling the divisions more or less arbitrary, under the name of the three great planes: the great spiritual plane, the great mental plane, and the great physical plane. It's on page 114. This, however, is more broadly a division that originated in Platonism than in Hermeticism specifically. And even then, the comparison is tenuous because all three worlds in the Kybalion are subject to the same laws, like vibration and correspondence, such that even God, or the All, is here technically subject to the ravages of causality rather than being above and outside of them. Calling the divisions arbitrary is also something no Platonist or Hermeticist would suffer. Compare this threefold division in the Kybalion to what Ficino says in his commentary on Plato's Symposium. Quote, "For the Platonists there are three worlds. First of all is God, the author of everything, who we say is the good itself. He created first the angelic mind," and this is a modification of the Platonic realm of forms first made by Augustine, sometimes just called angel. "Then he created the soul of this world, as Plato would have it, and last, the body of the world." End quote. So can we use this presence of the three worlds or other elements as a determining feature as to whether the Kybalion is essentially hermetic or not? Not specifically, but it can certainly show you the tenacity and reach in both time and space of the language inherent to the so-called Platonic underground and its many variations. Now, with that said, the Kybalion goes on to subdivide the three worlds into 7 minor planes, and then each of these are subdivided into 7 subplanes, totaling up to 147 planes, which, rather than occupying on multiple levels at once, each individual inhabits one at a time. I presume the number 7 was chosen throughout the work on account of the association with the classical 7 planets, but if that were the case, there's really little in the way of one-to-one correspondences there, and the concept is never really discussed or elaborated upon. In any case, this stuff about planes has no antecedent in any ancient Hermetic texts, but it does sound a lot like something analogous to what you would find in a theosophical work like Blavatsky's Secret Doctrine, especially when it starts getting into this euhemerist talk of how the gods of mankind were really just spiritually advanced masters who had ascended through the levels of spiritual evolution toward which our race as a whole is destined to evolve. These masters, endowed with the power of mental transmutation, had complete mastery over their own inner lives, and we should all aspire to the same. Now, moving on to another way in which the Kybalion cannot be said to be hermetic in any essential or substantial sense. Perhaps one of the more glaring differences between the Kybalion and the ancient material is how prominently God figures. That is, the God of the philosophers, in the sense of the one, the true, and the good, the form of all forms. In the very opening paragraph of the Hermetic Asclepius, a text actually attributed to Mercurius Trismegistus, he starts out the dialogue with God as the first word. "God, O Asclepius, God has brought you to us to participate in a divine discourse, and therefore such a one that rightly seems to be more divine in religious piety than all had by us or inspired in us by a divine Numen before. If you are seen to understand it, your entire mind will be filled to the brim with all good things, if there are still many good things, and not one in which all reside. For it is discerned that the one is in harmony with the other, that all are of one, or that one is all, for both are so connected to each other that one cannot be separated from the other." So here in the Asclepius, we can see how when God fills our minds to the brim, we behold that in some mysterious way, the one is the all, or all things are of one. This is why Hermeticists fill their discourses to the brim with knowledge about nature and the universe, the heavens and the earth, the gods above and below, and so on, because that totalizing image of the all is an attempt to raise people's minds up to that gnosis. This is one of Hermes' central points here, and note that it's God doing the filling. Here, not only is it that the One created the all, but also that the One is the all. This is why, for example, we have surviving statements in the alchemical work, the Chrysopoeia of Cleopatra, marked with the expression hen topan drawn in an ouroboros. One is all, and all is one. Now, in this respect, the Kybalion might indeed be said to be Hermetic, since it's certainly not Christian and certainly not Platonic insofar as it maintains that the One is the all. This is obviously a very different approach to the Christian God, who creates out of nothing and is set apart from his creation, and it's only somewhat consonant with the Middle Platonic tradition that operates via emanation, whereby the One, making perfect copies of itself, overflows out of its own infinitude into multiplicity, and thereby creates the noetic or intelligible world first, and thereafter the sensible world. Where the Kybalion really starts to differ from ancient Hermetic texts, however, is in the details. And one of the most important details is where God and the gods fit into everything, literally. Firstly, in the Kybalion, God and or the gods get either euhemerized or subsumed into a kind of pantheistic monad that is the ultimate reality. And although there is generally some element of this in traditional Hermetic texts, the Kybalion doesn't leave much, if any, room for the daily realities of ancient religion, or even more importantly, the concept of an experiential gnosis achieved through an encounter with a divinity, like Poimandres, or the spirit of perfect nature. It leaves out the presence of the gods of polytheism, the so-called sensible gods like Jupiter, Venus, and Mars, etc., and it leaves out the intellectual gods too. This to some would automatically exclude the Kybalion from their Hermetic canon, since it has fully cut off its more practical pagan or polytheistic roots. God and the gods are not an afterthought in the Hermetic corpus we've inherited from antiquity. They are not something you can just sweep under the rug by not discussing them. Instead of presenting the gnosis of the ancient Hermetica as a summum bonum, the Kybalion seems to place in its stead a kind of equanimity that is achievable through mental transmutation, and to me this rather pales as a highest good in comparison to the concept of ecstatic union with the divine, or epopteia, which is not only transformative but also salvific. Now, with that said, in light of all this union with the one business, there is also an arguably anti-pagan or anti-theurgical current that runs in Hermeticism, which the Kybalion could technically be seen to represent, but I don't think that this was a conscious attempt. In the Asclepius, for example, the highest and final teaching of Hermes is that God does not need your sacrifices because he already is all things. Instead, he or it desires only gratitude and the contemplation of pure minds. That is, minds refined by ascetic purification in a quasi-Pythagorean mode through ritual silence, through vegetarianism, etc. And he has no interest in blood or suffumigations. Hermeticism, that is, the teachings of Mercurius Trismegistus in the Latin Asclepius at least, is concerned with simple piety and the focus of the pure mind upon the one. It's not focused on the actions of the body. The Kybalion, given its own roots in Theosophy, American Transcendentalism, and chiefly New Thought, also stresses the mental elements of Hermeticism, but it does so at the expense of the practical, theurgical, and or magical elements of ancient religion in general, which you can find present in other so-called Hermetic texts. This, in the end, is probably because the ancient Hermetica and the Kybalion have very different end goals. The Kybalion leans into the whole mentalism and vibrational mental transmutation business in a way that was never really intended in antiquity, and this leaning in is really a product of its time. In the Kybalion, the One is the All. Just like in the Hermetic Asclepius, this we've seen to be the case. However, there's a major difference in how this is then further elaborated. In the Kybalion, not only is the One the All, but the All is also mind, because, as the first of the so-called principles goes, all is mind. This is a claim that does not sit well with most ancient branches of the Platonic underground, so to speak, at least not with most of the texts collected in the Corpus Hermeticum. So let's narrow in on this issue of mind in terms of a dimension in which the Kybalion is not like the ancient Hermetica. All is mind is a teaching of the American New Thought movement, which emerged throughout the late 19th century. This teaching is, I believe, ultimately a kind of fantasy of control. It's not like The Secret, it literally is the secret. It's the idea that all things are mental, and therefore mind can shape or manifest all material phenomena according to one's intentions. Or to use the Kybalion's own words on page 223, the very closing words of the book, it's the idea that, quote, if the universe is mental, then mind must be the highest power affecting its phenomena. If this be understood, then all the so-called miracles and wonder workings are seen plainly for what they are, that is, mind. Now, for a book that purports to explain the secrets of mind, it's notable that mind is actually never defined in the Kybalion, despite being used some 190 or so times throughout its pages. What we get instead is a kind of discursive exploration of how the all is mind, and as such, how this all is therefore subject to 7 principles. The Kybalion, page 146, says, by a knowledge of the principle of vibration, as applied to mental phenomena, one may polarize his mind at any degree he wishes, thus gaining a perfect control over his mental states, moods, etc. In the same way, he may affect the minds of others, producing the desired mental states in them. A little reflection on what we have said will show the student that the principle of vibration underlies the wonderful phenomena of the power manifested by the masters and adepts, who are able to apparently set aside the laws of nature, but who, in reality, are simply using one law against another, one principle against others, and who accomplish their results by changing the vibrations of material objects or forms of energy, and thus produce what are commonly called miracles. As one of the old Hermetic writers has truly said, he who understands the principle of vibration has grasped the scepter of power. End quote. So this is really the end goal of knowledge of the 7 principles according to the Kybalion's author. A perfect state over one's mental control and the ability to perform miracles. We'll come back to this. For now, it's important to talk about how, from a traditional philosophical point of view, mind, or intellect in Latin, though sometimes mens, nous in Greek, is an emanation or hypostasis in the Platonic cosmology, and consequently the Hermetic cosmology. Here the One is the highest principle. It emanates intellect, and then soul follows after, with the lowest extension of soul being body. This is simply not what's going on in the Kybalion, where things are more compressed to accommodate the famous or infamous law of attraction, which, as we have seen, is a central teaching of the Kybalion's author. Now, this idea that mind, or nous, or intellect, is an emanation from the One is important, and especially so in the history of Platonic philosophy in general, more so than that of Hermeticism in particular, because by virtue of the intellect being an emanation out from the One has generally been considered to be above and outside the intellect. And so, in that sense, the mind cannot be said to be consubstantial with the one all. In the Platonic tradition, and by extension Hermeticism, the path of creation or emanation is from the one to the many through the intelligible world, and then the path of goodness is from the many back to the one through the same medium. The mind cannot grasp or encompass the one except through the one's overflow, because it is beyond mind, and thus, when it is beheld, it's like a waterfall rushing down from high above. In the Asclepius, the mind can be filled to the brim with all good things, such that all those good things become one good thing, but you don't get the same kind of panpsychic pantheism that you get in the Kybalion, wherein the all equals the mind equals the one. You get something a little bit more hierarchically organized instead. The rational part of the intellectual soul can contemplate the one, the true, and the good, but mind itself is not the one, the true, and the good. It is its passive recipient, a kind of vessel which itself emanated out from the one. I think on this issue you can see the Kybalion tripping itself up a bit too, because it has the three worlds of the Platonic tradition, the great spiritual plane, the great mental plane, and the great physical plane. But notice that the mental plane is the middle world below the spiritual world. How can everything be infinite mind if the mental world is not even the supreme plane in the spiritual hierarchy? This just seems like an inconsistency to me. As a side note, I sometimes wonder how all of these sorts of distinctions would be dealt with in the French language, wherein the word for mind is esprit, which is the same word for spirit, though I suppose we certainly have the distinction between mental and spirituel. I could look this up since the Kybalion has been translated into French, but I have not done so yet. What's more on this issue of translation, however, is that things aren't even really so clear in English versions of the Hermetica either. In a recent monograph on Hermeticism by Christian Bull, for example, we find this mentioned in the translator's notes. Quote, "A difficult question presenting itself to every scholar dealing with the Hermetica is how to translate and understand nous. Mind, intellect, understanding, or consciousness might all be good translations. I have, for the most part, opted for mind, though sometimes I merely transliterate nous, especially in cases where the term seems more technical." End quote. So from this you can see that problems can also arise in translation when dealing with these kinds of technical philosophical terms, since people's understanding of mind in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was quite different from people's understanding of the Greek nous or the Latin mens or intellectus in the 2nd century, or in the Middle Ages for that matter. Anyhow, so what about the actual Corpus Hermeticum? What do its texts say about this subject of mind specifically? What we'll find is that there's actually quite a bit of diversity between the texts and how they deal with mind in the intelligible world, but as I hope to demonstrate, you'll see that it never really espouses the view contained in the Kybalion, except perhaps, arguably, in the Poimandres, Corpus Hermeticum 1. In the Poimandres, God is indeed called mind, and the light-giving word, the Logos, is the Son of God. The Logos, of course, being the rational ordering principle of existence, or the thing through which one thing is known to be better than another. Now, as I understand it, the word Poimandres itself probably means the mind of Ra, rather than the Greek shepherd of man, and Hermes frequently addresses the Poimandres as God, mind, and the word of sovereignty. Here, Hermes says, "Poimandres said to me, I am the light you saw. Mind, your God, he said, who existed before the watery nature that appeared out of darkness. The light-giving word who comes from mind is the Son of God." So, in this particular text, Poimandres, Corpus Hermeticum 1, Mind is God, and Word is the Son of God, and just like in Christian Trinitarian theology, both of these things are of one single essence, the one being a mirror image of the other. Mind and the Word then constitute all things in the universe, whether in its intelligible parts or its sensible material parts. Here are a few more details the perfect nature spirit in Hermes' vision adds. Quote, "From the counsel of God, which, having taken in the Word, and having seen the beautiful cosmos, imitated it, having become a cosmos through its own elements and its progeny of souls. The mind who is God, being androgyne, and existing as life and light, by speaking, gave birth to a second mind, a craftsman, who, as God of fire and spirit, crafted 7 governors. They encompass the sensible world in circles, and their government is called fate." End quote. So again, here mind is God, and through the Logos, the mental image God conceived of himself, he gives birth to a second mind, which is the demiurge, and also Ra, the sun, the source of all light and life in the sensible world below the intellectual world. In other words, a good guy. Man is then created in the image of the highest God, in the image of mind. Here, mind is not the all, but the father of all. It's probably worth mentioning here that the Logos gets no mention in the Kybalion whatsoever, and this is just an indispensable part of the Platonic and Hermetic traditions, and also the Christian tradition, which is probably why you see it excised here, as the Kybalion's author, by his own admission, has something of a personal disdain for quote-unquote theology as set against true wisdom, which is his 7 principles. Now, in Corpus Hermeticum 1, Poimandres says to Hermes, "Mind, the father of all, who is life and light, gave birth to a man like himself whom he loved as his own child. The man was most fair, and he had the Father's image, and God, who was really in love with his own form, bestowed on him all his craft works. And after the man had observed what the craftsman had created with the Father's help, he also wished to make some craft work, and the Father agreed to this. Entering the craftsman's sphere, where he was to have all authority, the man observed his brother's craft works. The governors loved the man, and each gave a share of his own order, learning well their essence and sharing in their nature. The man wished to break through the circumference of the circles to observe the rule of the one given power over the fire." So, in this cosmology, we can see how the demiurge, the sun, and the archons, the 7 planets, are not malevolent like they are in certain Gnostic sects. Man emulates the demiurge, his brother, and he is supported in his craftsmanship by the governors or archons. God creates the all through mind and word, and man governs the all through those same 2 things. Now, that's in the Poimandres, Corpus Hermeticum 1, which Jean-Pierre Maé considered to be a far more Gnostic text than the others in the collection. In Corpus Hermeticum 2, and admittedly most of the subsequent texts in the collection, we get something a little different, something a bit more Platonic, which is actually a lot harder to square with the Kybalion's all is mind axiom. Here it is stated explicitly that, quote, "God is not mind, but he is the cause of mind's being. He is not spirit, but the cause of spirit's being. And he is not light, but the cause of light's being. Hence, one must show God reverence with those 2 names assigned to him alone, and to no other. Except God alone, none of the other beings called gods, nor any human, nor any daimon, can be good in any degree. That good is he alone, and none other. All others are incapable of containing the nature of the good, because they are body and soul, and have no place that can contain the good. For the magnitude of the good is as great as the substance of all beings, corporeal and incorporeal, sensible and intelligible. This is the good. This is God. Here, in direct contradiction to the Poimandres, God is not mind, but the cause of mind's being. These texts take on an even more Platonic approach, an apophatic approach, positing that God is the one, the true and the good, and that mind is a kind of emanation below this. So, right away we can see it's quite clear that the Corpus Hermeticum is inconsistent on this question from text to text. Sometimes it vaguely leans into panpsychic pantheism like the Kybalion, but most of the time it leans into a more apophatic approach, broaching the subject of God through negative theology by saying what he or it is not rather than what he or it is. Here in Corpus Hermeticum 2, for example, God makes all things. He is not all things. He is the cause of all things. He is above them and separate. Set apart, set apart, set apart. Kadosh, 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 holy, holy, holy. Now, in Corpus Hermeticum 4, we are told man is created to be a spectator of God's work, and this is why all of mankind is endowed with reason, but not everyone is endowed with mind. This is where we get the story of the Crater Hermetis, popularized by Plato and guys like Ludovico Lazzarelli in the Renaissance. This is the great mixing bowl of Hermes, which God filled up with mind and invited humans to immerse themselves in it. Those who immersed themselves became perfect and received mind. They, quote, have scorned every corporeal and incorporeal thing, and they hasted toward the one and only. This, Tat, is the way to learn about mind, to resolve perplexities in divinity and understand God. So here in Corpus Hermeticum 4, mind is explicitly not synonymous with God, but it is a donum Dei, a gift of God, which some people choose to bask in, and others, like beasts or animals, do not, being more exclusively focused on the realm of sense. In Corpus Hermeticum 5, a discourse of Hermes to Tat, his son, that God is invisible and entirely visible, along which many other texts in the Corpus Hermeticum, it's clear God isn't so much mind as mind is the thing in which you experience God via revelation of the Gnosis. In Corpus Hermeticum 6, we get the following succession of divine beings. Quote, according to the Father's will, and unlike other living things on earth, mankind, the third living thing, came to be in the image of the cosmos, possessing mind as well as a relation not only of sympathy with the second God, but also of thought with the first God. For they have the perception of the former God as of a body, but they take thought of the latter as of a mind without a body, as of the good. So here mind is something that is possessed by man through a sympathy with the demiurge/sun on one level, and thought through his sympathy with God. God made the cosmos, and the cosmos is in God. The cosmos then made man, and man is in the cosmos, and as such, God begins, contains, and encompasses all things. Notice that this isn't exactly the same as God or the one is all things, as in the Kybalion. It's slightly more nuanced than that. Mind is the craftsman of all being, rather than being all being. Mind is God-like rather than God. Corpus Hermeticum 10 states, the mind is in the reason is in the soul, The soul is in the spirit. The spirit, passing through veins and arteries and blood, moves the living thing, and in a manner of speaking, bears it up. Just note that this cosmological breakdown differs from something you get in, say, the Picatrix, which conflates soul and spirit in many ways. Again, in Corpus Hermeticum 10, mind is the good daimon. Blessed is the soul completely full of mind. Wretched is the soul completely empty of it. Now, if we were operating in the Kybalion's cosmology, none of this could be because mind is all and all is mind. It's not something you can be devoid of. It's simply the ocean of being. And you, as an individual, are attuned to one or another level of its 147 plane breakdown. In Corpus Hermeticum 11, Mind to Hermes, mind and soul are referred to collectively as the energy of God. That is, mind is the working God does, not God in and of himself. The text states, God is the soul of eternity. Eternity is the soul of the cosmos. Heaven is the soul of earth. God is in mind, but mind is in soul, and soul is in matter, yet all of these exist through eternity. Alternatively, mind is seen in the act of understanding, God in the act of making. Now, again, things get a bit complicated, especially across various texts in the Corpus Hermeticum. Corpus Hermeticum 12 starts with the line, "Mind, O Tat, comes from the very essence of God, if, in fact, God has any essence, and God alone knows exactly what that essence might be. Mind, then, has not been cut off from God's essentiality." So here, again, mind is not God, or the all, but it shares in some of God's essence, if God can even be said to have any essence, because only God knows what his essence is, if anything. As such, this text aptly calls mind the soul of God, and, in a sense, almost places it on the same level as God. So much for the very first of the Hermetic principles, then. That is, if the Hermetic writings preserved and passed down by the ancients can't even agree on what the relationship between the mind, the all, and the one is. In recent decades, some scholars with a more romantic penchant, like Mahe and Fowden, have even tried to organize and hierarchize these differences into a kind of system of initiatory ascent, from a kind of optimistic monism focused on episteme to a pessimistic dualism focused on gnosis. But so far, no one's been able to prove convincingly that this collection of texts had any true theological coherence, regardless of what order they're put in. Now, in spite of these kinds of differences, which you may think are just the product of minor hair splitting, or you may think, yes, this indeed makes these two things incommensurable with one another, what the Kybalion and ancient underground Platonic currents like Hermeticism do have in common is the notion of an underlying substantial reality that is just beyond the veil, hiding beneath our phenomenal material realities. I think, however, that the Kybalion seems to take a more emphatically monistic and panentheistic approach than the more mystical approach of the Neoplatonists, who keep the one and the world quite set apart from each other through a series of intellectual hypostases. In any case, in the Kybalion, God or the One is synonymous with the All, and if the All is mind, therefore mind is God. This just simply is not a view espoused in the texts of the Corpus Hermeticum, except perhaps, as we've seen, in the Poimandres. In fact, this is a notion that was expressly rejected, if not by Hermeticists, then at least by medieval and Renaissance Platonists, who fought in reaction to the idea that the so-called active intellect, or prophetic mind of certain Arabic philosophers, was itself essentially God. For the medieval Platonic tradition that really held fast in the Latin West, we can turn to Macrobius's commentary of Scipio's dream. For example, quote, "Since mind emanated from the supreme God, and soul from mind, and mind forms and suffuses all below with life, and since this is the one splendor lighting up everything and visible in all, like a countenance reflected in many mirrors, arranged in a row, and since all follow in on continuous succession, degenerating step by step in their downward course, the close observer will find that from the supreme God, even to the bottommost dregs of the universe, there is one tie, binding at every link and never broken. This is the golden chain of Homer, which he tells us God ordered to hang down from the sky to earth." End quote. Mind here in Macrobius, pulling the Platonic party line, is an emanation of the supreme God or the One. It is the one splendor lighting up everything, or a countenance reflected in many mirrors, and the thing through which all close observers bind together the highest and the lowest thing. But it is not God, or the One, or the supreme unity. Instead, mind is a thing which can be filled to the brim with good things such that they all become one good thing, and in doing so, this one good thing grants a vision or epopteia of the one, the true, and the good, a kind of divine madness. This we might call the gnosis with a capital G, an experience of the one through the fewest possible number of intermediating forms. What is instead important in the light of the history of Hermeticism, if such a coherent ideology can really be said to exist at all, is the idea that God or the One has intellectual progeny. God makes the world through an idea in his mind or intellect, and this intellect is his Son, who of course is God, just not God the Father. This at least is what Marsilio Ficino or Arcangelo of Borgonovo thought was the important takeaway from Hermes, Zoroaster, Orpheus, Aglaophimus, Pythagoras, and Plato in the 15th and 16th centuries. It's the belief in this concept of intellectual progeny, specifically things like the Logos, that created the thread which bound all those ancient theologians, Prisci Theologi, into one single tradition. As such, God has a mind in which being and understanding are one and the same thing, but he, or it, is not consubstantial with mind, since the one is always above and outside of it. What mattered most to a man like Ficino was that Hermes was a kind of proto-Trinitarian prophet who knew the mysteries of the monad that begat a monad and reflected its ardor back upon itself. This brings me to my next point, which the Kybalion and Hermeticism have in common, and that is the importance of begetting, which seems to be addressed in the Kybalion, albeit with some subtle differences. Begetting is itself self-multiplication accomplished by a thing transferring a portion of itself to its offspring. The problem with this definition is that it cannot be applied to the all, which, according to the Kybalion, cannot suffer addition, multiplication, division, or subtraction. As such, the author relies on the metaphor of man creating things mentally rather than the metaphor of reproduction and giving birth, since in this way he uses no outside materials to make his creation. So much for the so-called principle of gender when you go far back enough up the chain of causality, then, I guess. With its distant roots in Near Eastern creation myths, this idea of God creating a god as a kind of metacosmogony is quite prevalent in the texts attributed to Hermes, and it survived antiquity in all manner of theological works, such as in the 12th century collection of aphorisms, the Book of 24 Philosophers. This idea remained important throughout the Middle Ages and carried on into the Renaissance. Again, you see this idea that God has intellectual progeny strongly emphasized in Marsilio Ficino's De Christiana Religione, a book he composed in the decade after he translated the Corpus Hermeticum, particularly in this section where he invokes the authority of Hermes, alongside a number of other key Prisci theologi, or ancient theologians. Quote, "Divine life, because it is the highest and most fruitful of all, generates offspring much more like itself than the rest, and it generates it within itself before birthing it outside of itself. It generates offspring, I repeat, by understanding just as God, by perfectly understanding himself and everything in himself, conceives the perfect idea of his entire self and of everything in himself, which is in fact the complete mirror image of God and the complete exemplar of the world above. This Orpheus called Pallas, who was born from the head of Jupiter alone. This Plato named the Son of God the Father in his letter to Hermias. In the Epinomis he dubbed it Logos, namely reason and word, saying, "The Logos, most divine of all, has ordained this visible world." Mercurius Trismegistus often makes mention of the Word and the Son of God, and also of the Spirit. Zoroaster also attributes intellectual offspring to God. Indeed, they said what they could, and even that was with the help of God. Only God, however, understands this, and whoever he wishes to reveal it to. The fertility of God, which is infinite good in actuality, extends itself infinitely from eternity in actuality by the nature of a boundless and eternal good. Whatever is outside of God is finite. Therefore, God extends himself in himself. Here, certainly, the infinite Son is of an infinite Father. It then follows that an offspring of this kind is innermost to God by a much greater degree, I would say, than the notion of an angel is to the angelic mind. In an angel, since being is certainly something other than understanding, the notion that is generated in the process of understanding is something other than the essence of the angel itself. In God, however, because being and understanding are the same thing, the notion that God begets by understanding himself is an image of his very self that is ever the most faithful. The Son is the same in essence as the very one who generates, although by the generation of some wondrous relation he is distinguished from the one who generates. Finally, God, the infinite good, understanding himself from eternity through an eternal notion of this kind, breathes infinite love from eternity through the same notion in himself toward himself. End quote. And note that that last little bit is taken right from the Book of 24 Philosophers, which was a scholastic work attributed to Hermes in the Latin West during the Middle Ages. And this isn't just cherry-picking either, since this is really all Ficino has to say about Hermes in the De Christiana Religione, which situates him as one figure in a line of theologians who believed there was a supreme principle, and that this principle begat the terrestrial, celestial, and supercelestial worlds by spewing forth a stream of self-images. In the Kybalion, the universe is a mental creation of the All, and I think this is also the case, with some modifications, in Christianity, in Gnosticism, in Judaism, and yes, in Platonism and Hermeticism, because the intelligible world is the first thing God creates, and thereafter the sensible. In all of our texts, the sensible world is the furthest extension outward from the One, or God, and mediating between them is the intellectual world. But where the difference lies, again, is that in the Kybalion, the One is the All, and the All is mind, rather than the mind being an emanation of the One. In other words, the God of the Kybalion is immanent through his panpsychism, while the God of the ancients was simultaneously immanent through his mental creation and transcendent by the fact that he or it dwells above and outside of the intellect, which is part of the realm of the many. To get a sense of the Platonist party line, here's a quote from Ficino's Platonic Theology, Book 4, Chapter 2 on this issue. There is something said to be above the all, and something said to be under the all. What is said to be above the all is God, who cannot properly be the all, because he is the utterly simple unity above number. He then gives us instead a threefold all, triplex omne sive totum triplex. This all is comprised of 1. God's unity, 2. Angel, that is, mind, mens, the all which comes immediately from God and is most like him, and 3. The matter of the world, which is one substance. The first all is changed by neither time nor space. The second all is subject to change in time, but not space, and the third all is subject to change both in time and space. Remember that in this cosmology, time is the moving image of eternity. So here in Ficino, the all is the three worlds we discussed earlier, but not God the Father himself, the creator of that world, who is eternally absconded in the layers of his own self-transcendence. I feel like this apophatic character is missing in the Kybalion, taking a more via positiva approach, and in this regard it differs quite substantially from late antique philosophy. Okay, so there are many more things here I could discuss in terms of wrestling with the substantive approach to the problem of whether the Kybalion is hermetic or not, talking about correspondences and sympathies, where things align and where they don't align, but I feel like this could also unravel into an endlessly tedious discussion about similarities and differences between texts, and it doesn't help that the corpus hermeticum itself is internally inconsistent. Instead of doing this, let's move on to discuss our other two approaches, the functionalist and the substantive. Part 2. The functionalist sense. So what is a functionalist approach to uncovering what constitutes a hermetic text? This is when we look not so much at the content or ideas of a given text, but when we try to identify what purpose that text serves. In this case, what I argue is the defining feature of what constitutes a hermetic text is that it is written to teach secrets in a kind of initiatory mode. In other words, a text that is esoterically didactic. It is a text which seeks to teach, but in a reserved way which hides as much as it reveals as it goes along. It doesn't matter what the text is trying to teach, whether that be pagan theology or astrology, ritual magic, the dyeing of metals, the search for the philosopher's stone, what have you. What matters is that it's framed in the mode of a hieratic discourse set between a master and his student, chiefly in the manner of an Egyptian priest instructing his acolytes. This is a sort of thread that weaves through much of the literature we call occult or esoteric, and it has little to do with what is said so much as how it is said. When I think of a text like the Picatrix, I can say it is hermetic in the sense that it is laden with exhortations to secrecy, to not reveal the contents of the work lest it fall into the wrong hands. It seeks to educate the sound right reader as a master instructing his student, but it does so in ways that are not immediately apparent to the casual observer. The Asclepius does this explicitly. All kinds of alchemical works do it through the use of deknomen. It's not at all an uncommon thing. It's precisely in this way that we often find all kinds of texts which don't espouse any particular hermetic ideology or dogma, nevertheless being called hermetic. This is compounded by the fact that, in late antiquity and in the Middle Ages, so many different kinds of instructional works on different subjects expressly began being attributed to Hermes or Mercurius the Thrice Great. Now, was this because they expressed a specific cosmology or ideology? Or is it simply that they were all written in an esoterically didactic mode, just as an Egyptian priest writing for his trainee? barring pseudepigraphical attribution, I think it's more likely for functionalist rather than substantivist reasons that this great variety of texts wound up bearing the name of Hermes. I would argue that the Kybalion is definitely Hermetic in this functionalist sense. It is most certainly written in that master-disciple mode that is typical of many other officially recognized Hermetic texts, whether they be practical or theoretical, taking the form of a didactic discourse from an ascended master commenting on sacred scripture before you, his lowly initiate. The Kybalion is a quintessentially esoteric text. It reveals just as much as it conceals. It makes an appeal to the diligence of the reader in order to understand its secrets beyond mere words, words, words. It's written from the vantage point that if a teacher were to lay out all of his cards at the beginning, without revealing them slowly and by degree, 2 steps forward and 1 step back, he would simply not be believed. And as such, it's better to lead the student anagogically, upward, step by step. This mode of discourse is part and parcel with the language of social distinction, that is, making distinctions between initiates and non-initiates, and it's in this context that we get the following explanation in the Kybalion for how its author uses the term hermetic. Quote, "Even to this day, we use the term hermetic in the sense of secret, sealed so that nothing can escape, etc. And this by means of the fact that the followers of Hermes always observed the principle of secrecy in their teachings. They did not believe in casting pearls before swine, but rather held to the teaching, milk for babes, meat for strong men, both of which maxims are familiar to readers of the Christian scriptures, but both of which had been used by the Egyptians for centuries before the Christian era." End quote. Now, notice that even here, by the author's own words, what he means by hermetic, he means in the sense of secret. As such, if we take him, or them, on their own terms, we must accept that the Kybalion is indeed a hermetic work, since it very clearly was written by its author or authors in order to reveal their cherished secrets, regardless of what those might be, whether they align with the kinds of ideas you find in the Corpus Hermeticum or not. The Kybalion then goes on to speak of the policy of careful dissemination of truth, and this is very much something that was part of the ancient Hermetic textual tradition. For example, the Latin Asclepius, which takes the form of a dialogue between 4 figures, Mercurius, Asclepius, Hammon, and Tat, is framed as one of these initiatic conversations between a master and his students. The whole text is framed by the following injunction in the opening. "Thou shalt summon no one else aside from Hammon, lest a most religious discourse on so great a matter be profaned by the intervention and presence of the many. For to divulge a treatise filled to the brim with the entire majesty of the Numen through the familiarity of the many belongs to an irreligious mind." So, notice what the author, Pseudo-Apuleius, or whatever we want to call him, is doing. He's writing a book to publish his secrets, but he's framing it in an initiatic framework in order to sacralize or sanction that revelation in some way. We can just as well look at the Picatrix, a far later, arguably Hermetic text, for similar injunctions to secrecy. Quote, "Know that these ancient philosophers kept this knowledge secret and were sworn not to divulge any of it to humankind. More precisely, they occulted this knowledge on account of its powers and discussed it through shrouded words, images, and symbols, as if discussing some other sciences. This decision to hide their knowledge is indicative of their honesty and goodwill, since if this knowledge were revealed to humankind, it would destroy the universe. On this account, the philosophers shared their knowledge figuratively, in such a way that none could understand it unless they were as enlightened in this knowledge as these philosophers were. Despite all their efforts at concealment, they nevertheless shared the paths and rules by which a sage might attain this knowledge and make progress in all the subjects that they discussed esoterically. It is for this reason that I compiled this book, and in it I intend to explain the means and ways to this knowledge, to outline what sages have said about it, and to reveal what they concealed in their works through exotic and deceptive words. I therefore pray to the highest Creator that this work of ours fall into the hands of no sage, lest they be capable of following everything I am about to say herein, and consider it beneficial, such that everything done through it be done for the good and in the service of God." End quote. Now, something to be conscious of here is that the knowledge being spoken about here in the Picatrix is not the same knowledge discussed in the Kybalion. They are simply two different traditions. One is astral magic and the practical use of talismans. The other is a kind of Egyptian veneered distillation of 19th century New Thought, packaged with some ideas from Theosophy. Throughout its pages, the Kybalion speaks often but nebulously of a truth, often calling it the secret doctrine, a wink and a nudge to Theosophy, and it says all religions possess a part of it, but it doesn't really deliver on what this truth or flame or pearl really is, unless the author means, of course, his 7 Hermetic principles, which could hardly be said to be a feature of every religion, except of course to someone doing a kind of perennialist cherry-picking. The author appears to write as if Hermeticism is a master key to understanding all belief systems, not a belief system of its own. The Picatrix doesn't speak of Hermeticism at all, of course, but it cites many texts with parts attributed to Hermes, such as the Secret of Secrets or the pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica, something the Kybalion does not do at all. When I think of an actual tradition, I think of something like Rabbinic Judaism, whereby rabbis cite one another and can cite all the way back along an unbroken chain of texts and authors and commentators and super commentators. You get none of that in the Kybalion because it doesn't really belong to a Hermetic tradition. It belongs to the New Thought and Theosophical traditions, the latter of which is arguably connected, but also a totally different thing with its own history. There are some similarities in the underlying worldviews between Theosophy and late antique Hermeticism, especially a similar grammar, but when you dig into the details, the similarities are often quite superficial. Theosophy was far more influenced by syncretic Western interpretations of what Eastern religions believed, so Buddhism, Hinduism, for example, while Hermeticism is an umbrella term used to cover a variety of different esoteric disciplines, like astral magic and alchemy, which on their own are natural philosophical traditions distinct from theology with their own texts and authors. One of the ways you can really know the Kybalion is a theosophically inspired work is in the ways it places Hermes as the source of all esoteric knowledge, including Indian knowledge. And this is just simply not true, and it is definitely not something that the ancients, who were familiar with both Indian and Egyptian knowledge in many ways, believed. This is the rash caused by one of those old 19th century colonial impulses to compress the infinite diversity of world religions into one easy to grasp, easy to extract, and easy to govern form that is totally uprooted from any real living tradition. Here in the Kybalion, Hermes is described as being older than Moses and a contemporary of Abraham. And this is not something I've heard elsewhere before, except perhaps in the Enoch equals the first Hermes connection made in the Arabic world, such as in Abu Mashar. Even then, this view doesn't make him a contemporary of Abraham. In the Renaissance, the more widespread belief, although it was debated, was that Hermes was a contemporary of Moses, contemporaneus Moesi in the Latin from the famous Siena Cathedral inscription. During the Renaissance, it was often argued for this reason as to which figure invented writing between these two: Moses, the prophet of prophets, or Hermes, a pagan magician. I'll leave it for you to decide which side won out in the end among Christians, Muslims, and Jews, especially when you consider the contents of Exodus chapter 7. Now, before I wrap up this section, I wanted to give the devil his due, so to speak, and add a note to drive home the point that in the 19th century, the criteria a text needed to meet in order for people to consider it hermetic was far, far less strict than later in the 20th or early 21st centuries. And I would argue that's because in the 19th century, people by and large followed the functionalist sense of the word hermetic, not the nominalist or the substantive sense. To get a sense of this, we can turn to General E. A. Hitchcock's 1868 catalog of books on Hermetic philosophy. This was incidentally by the same man who in 1858 authored a book entitled Swedenborg, a Hermetic philosopher, showing that Emanuel Swedenborg was a Hermetic philosopher and that his writings may be interpreted from the point of view of Hermetic philosophy. Now, in his catalog, Hitchcock gathered under a single aegis works as different in nature as Agrippa's books on occult philosophy, Robert Boyle's The Skeptical Chemist, Gaston Ledoux's Le Dictionnaire Hermétique, books on hieroglyphs, dream interpretation, astrology, omens, optics, Galenic medicine, metaphysics, spiritism, conversations with angels, alchemy, the actions of subterranean and invisible people, namely elves, fauns, and fairies, books on Leibniz, books on youth preservation and life extension, books on physiognomy, and so on and so forth. So notice how here any text that was vaguely occult or esoteric in nature could be called hermetic, because the point was that it was a text about secrets, that it was hermetically sealed to the uninitiated. Not that it was a text attributed to Hermes, or a text containing a specific set of doctrines from antiquity. This, I think, is a very important point if we want to understand people in the late 18th and 19th centuries and what they thought of when they used the term hermetic, like in Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, since it generally didn't refer to the same definitive set of things that we refer to today. So, to summarize cumulatively the points I've made thus far in parts 1 and 2. Yes, I do believe the Kybalion can be considered a hermetic work in the functionalist sense, that is, in the sense that the author of the Kybalion is himself using by his own admission. But no, I don't really believe the Kybalion can be considered hermetic in a substantive sense. That is, if we can even agree on a substantive definition of Hermeticism to begin with, especially in the face of so much ideological diversity in these texts. So what about the final sense? Part 3. The Nominalist sense. The last and final approach trying to understand the problem of whether a text is truly hermetic or not is the favorite of academics, and often the most hated by religionists and practitioners for its narrowness, and that's the nominalist approach. Simply put, if there is no spiritual essence, substance, or form of Hermeticism, that little je ne sais quoi that makes a hermetic text really hermetic, then at the very least, can we say a text is hermetic if it bears the name of Hermes? Christian Bull, in the recent Brill tome on Hermeticism, states, for example, that a book is hermetic when it derives, quote, from the Egyptian Hermes himself, or was written by a priest inspired by Hermes and then attributed to him, end quote. It's notable to mention here that the very first self-proclaimed Hermeticist did not come from antiquity, but was from the Renaissance period. This was Ludovico Lazzarelli, who wrote, Christianus ego sum, o rex, et hermeticum simul esse non pudet. I am a Christian, O king, and at the same time, I am not ashamed to be a Hermeticist. This was the Kabbalist and poet who identified the poimandres of the Corpus Hermeticum with Christ, who he called the father of every talisman in the world. As such, from a nominalist approach, the very first Hermeticist known to history was Lazzarelli, even if there were many texts bearing the name of Hermes preceding his time. This was an argument first put forward by Wouter Hanegraaff. What we have from antiquity, instead, is quotes from Neoplatonists like Iamblichus saying things like, quote, Hermes, the god who rules over rational discourse, logos, has long been considered, quite rightly, to be the common patron of all priests. He who presides over true knowledge about the gods is one and the same always and everywhere. It is to him that our ancestors in particular dedicated the discoveries of their wisdom, attributing all of their own writings to Hermes. End quote. So here in antiquity, you can see there isn't so much an idea of Hermeticism as a concrete set of dogmas, so much as the idea that Hermes presides over rational discourse, the true knowledge of the gods, and priests everywhere, such that the ancients attributed their writings to him. It's in this sense that we can see Iamblichus speaking of Hermetic doctrines, hermaikai doxai, Hermetic systems, hermaikai diataxes, Hermetic concepts, hermaikai noemata, and Hermetic books, hermaikai biblioi. Now, when it comes to the Kybalion, we can say that the ideas in it are kind of attributed to Hermes, albeit filtered through the so-called three initiates. So it's not technically attributed to Hermes so much as dedicated to him. It's notable that the dedication in the 1908 edition, published by the Yogi Publication Society in Chicago, states explicitly, to Hermes Trismegistus, known by the ancient Egyptians as the great master of masters, this little volume of Hermetic teachings is reverently dedicated. This means that this is not a text pseudepigraphically attributed to Hermes. Nobody is saying Hermes or Mercurius wrote it, and in that sense, it's not a Hermetic text in the way the Poimandres or the Asclepius are. Now, insofar as the Kybalion is dedicated to Hermes, it's arguably Hermetic, but it doesn't help that throughout the body of the text, it doesn't tap into much of the actual literary tradition of texts attributed to Hermes, whether practical or magical, like the Picatrix or alchemical texts, or theoretical, theological, like the Asclepius or other texts that make up the Corpus Hermeticum today. It's definitely worthy of mention here that the author of the Kybalion wrote his work long before the Nag Hammadi library was discovered in 1945, which was a major source of actual Hermetic texts from antiquity for scholars. It's also notable that Arthur Darby Nock and André-Jean Festugieres' magisterial studies of the Corpus Hermeticum hadn't come out yet either. Neither had Walter Scott's Hermetica. He could have possibly availed himself of Ficino's Latin translations of the corpus he called as a whole Pimander, but I doubt he did since there's really no evidence of it. The first real academic study of Hermeticism in the 20th century, specifically the Poimandres, was published in German in 1904 by Richard Reitzenstein, and he was a member of the History of Religion School, which was chiefly concerned with understanding early Christianity and the mystery cults, and this was only 4 years before the Kybalion was published in America. Aside from something like the Emerald Tablet, which from what I can tell makes up the main source for the Kybalion, or at least one single line from it, there's very little here that is actually ancient. And if the three initiates were really working with a secret Hermetic oral tradition, not much of what it comprised lines up with what was found in the ancient material. The author says nothing in the book is new. Meanwhile, Its contents align suspiciously with the axioms of 19th century New Thought, colored by a touch of Theosophy, Emersonian transcendentalism, and speculative Freemasonry. In this light, the teachings of the Kybalion are more akin to mesmerism and Mary Baker Eddy's Christian Science than it is to the Poimandres or the Teleos Logos, the perfect discourse. All this talk about the law of attraction, or laws in general, of higher and lower vibrations and so on, is entirely absent from the ancient materials bearing Hermes' name. These were all later developments in the history of ideas, and they were mostly the fruit of many attempts to reconcile all kinds of new developments in materialist science with opposed but equally prevailing spiritualist, psychological, parapsychological, and in this case, Egypto-maniacal currents that were thriving throughout the 19th century. This is why in the Kybalion you get mention of things like electrons and energy waves and the plane of ethereal substance side by side with more traditional language. These particular terms and scientific concepts could not possibly have been discussed in the ancient Hermetica, whose authors lived under a fundamentally different scientific paradigm, which they themselves went at great length to explain. Now, the Kybalion's central concept, as was alluded to earlier, is the belief in the existence of 7 universal principles or laws that govern all levels of reality. These are mentalism, correspondence, vibration, polarity, rhythm, cause and effect, and gender. But even this totalizing idea that there are laws governing all of reality, such as 7 principles, is a relic of 18th and 19th century science rather than a reflection of ancient belief. And of course, any physicist, chemist, biologist, or philosopher of science in the 21st century will tell you that we don't have laws of nature, but instead have descriptions or predictive models of nature which can potentially help us to anticipate the workings of the world, but these are ultimately provisional, never immutable laws. So, these were not ideas present in ancient Hermetic texts, but they certainly were the kinds of ideas that appeared elsewhere, in very similar language, in books of William Walker Atkinson, such as The Law of New Thought, a study of fundamental principles and their application; Dynamic Thought, or the Law of Vibrant Energy; The Inner Consciousness, a course of lessons on the inner planes of the mind, intuition, instinct, automatic mentation, and other wonderful phases of mental phenomena; The Mastery of Being, a study of the ultimate principle of reality and the practical application thereof; The Art and Science of Personal Magnetism, the Secrets of Mental Fascination, and so on. While there's obviously nothing wrong with positive thinking, quite the opposite in fact, there's definitely something wrong with some of the near solipsistic ideas that were floating around in the New Thought movement concerning the power of mind over matter, especially the idea that disease and human mortality were merely the results of a mind which had not attained to spiritual enlightenment. This idea was responsible for an immense amount of unnecessary suffering, and it's all part and parcel with the belief that there are no material vicissitudes impinging on our lives. There's nothing left up to chance, nothing left up to misfortune, or even potentially someone else's malice for that matter. For this reason, by the 1990s, we could still hear Metallica's James Hetfield railing against his mother's faith on the so-called Black Album in the song God That Failed, after she died of cancer as a fervent believer in Mary Baker Eddy's Christian Science, which had led her to refuse any kinds of modern medical treatments before ultimately passing away. Real Hermetic texts generally don't exhibit such a hostile, Gnostic approach to the material world and the human condition. And certainly the practical Hermetica in particular is definitely not averse to the use of medicines of all kinds, medicines that straddle the boundaries of the spiritual and the material. In the Begetrix, for example, we see its author, an Andalusian Hermetic alchemist and astral magician, break down the science of magic as follows. One part of this magical science is practical, on account of how it works by operating with spirit on spirit, making things similar that are not so by their essence. Working with images or talismans, however, involves the work of spirit on matter, and alchemical work involves the work of matter on matter. So clearly, at least in the Middle Ages, the material world was not scorned in the same way it became in the New Thought movement. There's another more recent part in this story that I think is often left unsaid, and this is probably a bit more relevant to my audience than developments in the late 1800s. That is, I very clearly recall Terence McKenna in his lectures on Yeats's Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic tradition from the mid-90s used to pass on something of this idea that Hermeticism is some kind of optimistic, pro-human answer to the pessimism of the Christian religion and its emphasis on our sin and fallenness. So, this is an idea with a lot of staying power in some of the more secular parts of American society, but this is not at all how Yeats described the Hermetic tradition in her book, and it definitely was not how it was thought about by people like Lazzarelli or Agrippa in the Renaissance, men who conceived of it as an ancient pagan theological forerunner to Christianity rather than its spiritual antithesis. This is, however, entirely how the New Thought movement conceived of Hermeticism, as something which would replace the pessimism of the old paradigm of old thought. And I find this ironic, since its proponents spent so much time and effort on trying to portray their movement as the wisdom of the ancients. Now, I don't think McKenna ever mentioned the Kybalion directly in his lectures, though I could be wrong, but I think there were a lot of people out there in the 90s and early 2000s who took McKenna's characterization of the movement at face value, and the Kybalion just happened to be widely available to catch people and give them what they were looking for. In this case, an escape window to get away from the rising tide of conservative evangelical quote-unquote religion without jettisoning quote-unquote spirituality altogether and becoming hardline materialists. Now, the Kybalion speaks of groups of so-called Hermetists hiding underground and transmitting their knowledge in secret across the generations. But in spite of all these fanciful stories, it ultimately offers no real proof such groups ever existed in the way of evidence, textual or otherwise. The author speaks of persecutions, of cries from the multitude shouting, "Crucify, crucify," and yet cites no examples, no names, no people, no texts. Well, I suppose there is one source the Kybalion cites all the time, and that is the Kybalion. I find this to be somewhat of a distasteful practice, that is, the author framing his own unverified personal gnosis as if it was a source written long ago, a source to which only he has exclusive access, written in God knows what language originally. So, the book is framed as a commentary on a set of aphorisms, teachings of an ancient mystery tradition, but as far as I know, these aphorisms don't appear in any text prior to this text, but they themselves are to be thought of as the Kybalion proper, and then they are accompanied with a sort of hyper-commentary. So the author invents a kind of text to comment upon, and this, of course, is a time-honored esoteric rhetorical device, which allows him to reveal secret knowledge without basically saying that he made it up as a pious fraud at the same time as he wrote his commentary. Or, to be more charitable, that he assembled his ideas from prevailing currents in the late 19th, early 20th centuries and represented them as ancient. Even the word Kybalion, which ostensibly sounds Greek, as if it were related to the Phrygian goddess Cybele or maybe even Kabbalah doesn't actually mean anything or even have any attestation in antiquity. The author simply says, the exact significance and meaning of the term has been lost for several centuries, inspiring little confidence in its authenticity. Now, a note on alchemy. The Kybalion follows in the 19th century trend set by occultists like Thomas South, Anne Atwood, Ethan Allen Hitchcock, and William Wynne Westcott, which maintained that true alchemy is, in fact, like speculative masonry, a spiritual pursuit dressed up with the exoteric trappings of a material pursuit. What it was really about was changing mental vibrations, not about material transformations. Now, I've argued elsewhere that this sort of thing is really a hardcore retrojection of 19th century armchair alchemists' imaginations back onto real, historically attested alchemical pursuits that were in fact material in nature, even if they borrowed their language for alchemical transformations from prevailing spiritual and philosophical systems. All this stuff about vibrations can essentially be traced back to the work of David Hartley, who lived throughout the first half of the 18th century. The idea that real or true alchemy is spiritual and material alchemy was a base or fraudulent pursuit is just not a dichotomy that the historical record bears out. The belief is historically a rather late phenomenon born out of speculative alchemy, which comes after the development of practical alchemy, not before it. What we really see in the history of alchemy is a rich body of practical scientific knowledge that was coded in the language of religion. In the same way, modern science is self-reflexive in its metaphors, in that it seeks to explain nature using nature, such as in the orbit of electrons. The alchemists of the past attempted to explain natural processes with spiritual allegories, and in doing so, they saw the whole world as one great symbolic whole held together with chains of concord. This is not really what the Kybalion portrays alchemy as, which is, quote, the art of changing and transforming mental states, forms, and conditions into others, through the understanding of reality's universal principles. Here, because all is mind, everything is sublimated into the psychological sphere. Nothing practical is of any worth. No material transmutations, no manipulation of symbols or tokens, no talismanic magic to effect changes here and now, no hands-on astrology, no science, natural philosophy, none of this really. Everything is reduced to psychology, or in the Kybalion's own words, chemistry on the mental plane. This view, as I'm concerned, is simply not Hermetic, at least in the sense that it has no antecedent in the Hermetic textual tradition, varied as it is. In conclusion, now, there is plenty more that could be said about comparing and contrasting the contents of the Kybalion vis-à-vis the contents of the various texts attributed to Hermes Trismegistus. This particular talk has gone on long enough, and I think that it suffices to have answered the one question I set out to answer at the beginning. Is the Kybalion really Hermetic? To which I have appropriately given a threefold answer. Substantively speaking, as a set of traditional doctrines? Somewhat, but not really. Functionally speaking, as a text participating in an esoteric, didactic genre that is in constant renegotiation? Sure. And nominally speaking, as a text attributed to Hermes? Not really, though it is dedicated to him. In the end, we have a maybe, a yes, and a no. So, ultimately, is the Kybalion Hermetic or not? You tell me. Regardless of the answer to this question, what we should really be asking is it a text of any value? Again, for this question, you'll have to tell me. I suppose your answer will depend on how much weight you put on the ideas that were in vogue among late 19th and early 20th century occultists, rather than those that were in vogue among 2nd century Greco-Egyptian philosopher theologians. Whichever path you choose is yours to decide, and there's no reason you can't study both, or neither, but it's just best not to conflate the two traditions, or centuries worth of traditions, into one seamless whole in the way many in the New Age do today, because this papers over all kinds of differences that would have been very important to the people writing these ideas down. At the end of the day, what I think the Kybalion really is, once you get past all the staging, all the smoke and mirrors, is an exploration or elaboration of 7 ways in which the Emerald Tablet's statement, as above, so below, deploys itself in the world, and how related hidden principles were understood to operate in the world by adherents of New Thought or quote-unquote mind cure in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. If that's what you're after, go for it. If you're after actual ancient Greco-Egyptian Hermetic philosophy, theology, and or magic, however, go to the ancient sources. And if you can't read them in their original language, read them in as many translations as you can, with as many commentaries as you can, and over time, both the similarities and the differences between these two systems of thought should become increasingly apparent. Now, the Kybalion was certainly a text that I read in my early 20s when I was a lot more interested in 19th and early 20th century currents, as one of many branches of 19th century philosophy, and I can't deny that they played some role in my own development. It's not for no reason I've lately been posting so much Thomas Taylor lately, since he was certainly a big part of 18th and 19th century thought. He was, for example, a huge influence on thinkers as far apart as William Blake and Manly P. Hall. So this era still holds a special place in my heart. Over the past decade, however, you could say I've gradually gone trad, although from my own perspective, I'm just increasingly trying to follow the old Renaissance humanist tradition of returning ad fontes, that is, going back to the sources of these ideas to read the original texts in their original forms, and then cutting off any issues at the root. I was certainly interested in much of this 19th century material about a decade ago, and even incorporated some of it into my own work here, but more recently I've set this sort of material aside to dedicate my attention more exclusively to the sources, to Platonic philosophy, Christian and Jewish mysticism, and ancient and medieval Hermetic texts instead of the modern ones. Again, this isn't so much as a result of any kind of purity spiraling on my part, so much as an attempt to revive that old humanist spirit of returning to the sources, and I have to work within my own linguistic limitations as well. I also think we can go and find out what the ancient texts had to say on their own terms, rather than trying to bring them all to heel beneath the aegis of some kind of transcendental or perennial gnosis that pretends to bind them all together, which is totally what the Kybalion was an attempt to do with its 7 principles. This attempt is like a kind of spiritual power grab over the complexity of the world, a metaphysical coup d'etat against the many, if you will. Ultimately, I think the attempt to encapsulate all of reality into a few simple axioms is a pretension that was perhaps part and parcel with the prevailing colonial impulses of the age that produced it. The impulse to expand the empire of the known, to answer every mystery, to bind, to subjugate, to tame the exotic and the uncivilized, to flatten all diversity into one easily governable mass, to take things out of the hands of fate or providence, to call everything mental, and thereby to make it tame and controllable. These are just not impulses I personally share. Instead, what I prefer to do is to encounter a great variety of traditions and let them speak their wisdom to me, or their follies, from where they are, with their own voices, from within their own contexts, without the need for me to categorize and systematize everything into one clear-cut and aphoristically explainable master narrative that compresses out all the differences between traditions. What I like about studying the various branches of the Platonic underground is that they all had their similarities, but since they all came from different parts of the Roman Empire, they also had intense local differences and disagreements. And it was perfectly acceptable to hold these, so long as they could defend their points of view when challenged. What becomes interesting to me, then, down in this material body of mine, is the reasonings they give in coming to those conclusions, rather than the conclusions themselves, and then letting the tensions, contradictions, and paradoxes stand like a brilliant fire, all gathered together in a roaring blaze of light.